Marcus stepped out of his apartment, the warm morning sun greeting him as he began his daily routine. At 25, he had a steady job as a mechanic and was saving up to propose to his girlfriend, Tasha. Life wasn't perfect, but Marcus felt content and hopeful about his future. As he walked into the convenience store to grab a quick breakfast, Marcus had no idea his world was about to shatter. He browsed the aisles, picking up a breakfast sandwich and a bottle of juice. At the counter, he reached for his wallet, only to realize he'd left it at home. "I'm sorry," Marcus said to the cashier, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "I forgot my wallet. I'll just put these back and come back later." As Marcus turned to return the items, a middle-aged white woman at the back of the store shouted, "He's stealing. I saw him put something in his pocket." Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't taken anything, but he knew how this looked. "No, ma'am, you're mistaken. I don't have anything in my pockets." The cashier's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Empty your pockets," he demanded. Marcus complied, his hands shaking slightly as he turned out his empty pockets. But the damage was done. The cashier had already called the police. Within minutes, 2 officers burst through the door, hands on their holsters. "Hands where we can see them," one officer shouted. Marcus raised his hands, fear gripping his chest. "Officers, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't take anything." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers roughly handcuffed him, ignoring his attempts to explain. As they led him to the patrol car, Marcus noticed the stares of passers-by, their eyes filled with judgment and fear. In that moment, Marcus became another statistic. According to a study by the Stanford Open Policing Project, black drivers are 20% more likely to be stopped by police than white drivers relative to their share of the population. Once stopped, black individuals are searched about 1.5 to 2 times as often as white individuals. As the patrol car door slammed shut, Marcus felt the weight of these statistics pressing down on him. He knew that from this moment on, he would be fighting an uphill battle against a system that seemed designed to work against him. At the police station, Marcus was fingerprinted and photographed, his protests falling on indifferent ears. The detective questioning him seemed more interested in closing the case quickly than finding the truth. "Just admit you took something, and we can wrap this up," the detective said, his tone casual but his eyes cold. Marcus shook his head, fear and anger warring inside him. "I didn't take anything. This is all a mistake." But his words seemed to evaporate in the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room. By the end of the day, Marcus found himself charged with petty theft, facing the prospect of a trial that could change the course of his life. As he sat in a holding cell, waiting for Tasha to scrape together enough money for bail, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The real battle, he realized, would be fought in a courtroom where the odds already seemed stacked against him. The gavel's sharp crack silenced the courtroom. All eyes turned to the bench, where Judge Harrison peered down at Marcus with barely concealed contempt. In that moment, Marcus realized he wasn't just facing charges, he was up against a system designed to break him. How could he possibly get a fair trial when the deck was so clearly stacked? Marcus stood rigid, his palms sweating as he surveyed the courtroom. The air felt thick with tension, every breath a struggle against the weight of judgment pressing down on him. To his left, his public defender shuffled papers nervously, avoiding eye contact. On the right, the prosecutor wore a smug smile, as if victory was already assured. As the trial began, Marcus's hopes for justice quickly unraveled. The prosecution painted a picture of him as a hardened criminal, twisting the facts of that fateful day in the convenience store. They emphasized his suspicious behavior and aggressive demeanor when confronted by the police, conveniently omitting the fact that Marcus had cooperated fully. Marcus's heart sank as he watched his public defender struggle to mount any sort of defense. The lawyer seemed overwhelmed, unprepared to challenge the prosecution's narrative. Marcus thought of the statistics he'd read while waiting for his trial date, how public defenders often juggled hundreds of cases simultaneously, leaving them little time to adequately prepare for each one. The reality of those numbers now stared him in the face. As witness after witness took the stand, Marcus felt the noose of injustice tightening around his neck. The store clerk's testimony was particularly damning, filled with vague recollections that somehow became certainties under the prosecutor's leading questions. Marcus wanted to scream out the truth, but his lawyer advised him to remain silent, fearing his emotions might be perceived as aggression. The final blow came when Judge Harrison began his deliberation. Marcus searched the judge's face for any sign of impartiality, but found only cold disdain. As the judge spoke, each word fell like a hammer blow, sealing Marcus's fate. Given the defendant's clear disregard for the law and the danger he poses to society, Judge Harrison intoned, his voice dripping with contempt, "I hereby sentence Marcus Johnson to 10 years in state prison." The sentence hit Marcus like a physical blow. 10 years. A decade of his life, gone in an instant. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, but Marcus heard nothing over the roaring in his ears. He stood frozen, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. As the bailiff approached to lead him away, reality came crashing down. Marcus caught a glimpse of his mother in the gallery, her face contorted with anguish. He wanted to reassure her, to promise he'd be okay, but no words came. Instead, he allowed himself to be led out of the courtroom, his mind reeling as he tried to grasp the harsh new reality of his future. Marcus stepped into the prison yard, the clanging of the gate behind him echoing like a death knell. The harsh sunlight assaulted his eyes, a stark contrast to the dim holding cells he'd occupied for the past week. As he scanned the yard, a sea of orange jumpsuits and hard faces stared back at him. The reality of his situation hit him with full force. This was his new home for the next decade. The first few days were a blur of procedural humiliation. Strip searches, medical exams, and the constant bark of orders from guards left Marcus feeling less than human. He was assigned to a cramped cell with a cellmate named Ray, a weathered man with tattoos snaking up his arms. Ray eyed him warily but said little, leaving Marcus to grapple with his thoughts in suffocating silence. Navigating the unwritten rules of prison life proved treacherous. In the cafeteria, Marcus inadvertently sat at a table claimed by a group of white supremacists. The menacing glares and muttered threats made it clear he'd made a dangerous mistake. He quickly learned to watch, listen, and keep to himself, all while trying to quell the constant fear churning in his gut. The guards were another source of constant tension. Some seemed to revel in their power, using any excuse to exert their authority. Marcus witnessed a young inmate being beaten for a minor infraction, the sickening thuds of batons on flesh searing into his memory. He realized that here, justice was a foreign concept. As weeks turned into months, depression settled over Marcus like a heavy shroud. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying the events that led him here, wondering how his life had derailed so completely. Thoughts of Tasha and his mother brought both comfort and anguish. Were they moving on without him? The weight of missed birthdays, holidays, and life milestones threatened to crush his spirit. Statistics on the psychological impact of incarceration rang true for Marcus. Studies show that up to 25% of prisoners experience symptoms of severe depression, with rates of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder also significantly higher than in the general population. Marcus felt himself becoming a living statistic, his hope draining away with each passing day. One particularly bleak afternoon, Marcus found himself considering the darkest of thoughts. As he sat on his bunk, staring at the crude shiv he'd fashioned for protection, he wondered if ending it all might be easier than facing the years stretching ahead. The cold metal seemed to offer a perverse form of freedom, but as he turned the makeshift weapon over in his hands, a memory surfaced, his mother's voice, strong and clear, telling him, "Education is the one thing they can never take from you." It was as if a spark ignited in the darkness of his despair. Marcus realized he had a choice: let this place consume him, or use this time to arm himself with knowledge. With renewed purpose, Marcus began to seek out every educational opportunity the prison offered. He signed up for GED classes, borrowed books from the understocked library, and even convinced a sympathetic guard to bring him old newspapers. As he immersed himself in learning, Marcus felt a shift within himself. The prison walls still confined his body, but his mind was beginning to soar beyond them. Marcus's eyes widened as he stepped into the prison library for the first time. Rows of bookshelves stretched before him, each one a gateway to knowledge he had never imagined possible behind bars. His fingers trailed along the spines of law books, history texts, and social justice literature. A spark of hope ignited in his chest. Here was the key to understanding the system that had wronged him. With newfound determination, Marcus threw himself into studying. He pored over legal texts, dissecting every word and clause. The complexities of the justice system began to unfold before him, revealing both its strengths and its glaring flaws. As he read about landmark cases and constitutional rights, Marcus couldn't help but see the stark contrast between the ideals of justice and the reality of his own experience, but the path to enlightenment was far from smooth. Marcus faced constant obstacles in his quest for knowledge. Library hours were limited, and competition for popular books was fierce. He often found himself racing against time, trying to absorb as much information as possible before being ushered back to his cell. Some guards viewed his studious nature with suspicion, making snide remarks or creating unnecessary delays. Despite these challenges, Marcus persevered. He began to see his own case in a new light, recognizing the many ways the system had failed him. The racial bias, the inadequate defense, the harsh sentencing, all of it became clear as he gained a deeper understanding of the law. This knowledge was both empowering and infuriating, fueling his desire to fight for justice. As Marcus's expertise grew, so did his reputation among fellow inmates. They began to seek him out for legal advice, and he found himself becoming an unofficial jailhouse lawyer. This role gave him a sense of purpose, a way to use his hard-earned knowledge to help others who had been similarly wronged by the system. The years passed, marked by the steady accumulation of knowledge. Marcus watched as some inmates who pursued education were released early, their recidivism rates significantly lower than those who didn't. According to a study he read, prisoners who participated in educational programs were 43% less likely to return to prison than those who didn't. These statistics gave Marcus hope for his own future beyond the prison walls. As his release date approached, Marcus felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. He had transformed himself from a wrongly convicted young man into a self-taught legal expert. But would this knowledge be enough to navigate the challenges of life after incarceration? Would he be able to clear his name and seek the justice he now knew he deserved? On the day of his release, Marcus stood at the prison gates, a decade older but immeasurably wiser. The weight of his legal books in his bag was a reminder of the journey he had undertaken. As the gates opened, Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for the fight ahead. He may have served his unjust sentence, but his battle for justice was far from over. With each step towards freedom, Marcus's mind raced with plans to challenge the system that had failed him and so many others. Freedom. A word that had haunted Marcus's dreams for a decade. Now, standing on the other side of those imposing gates, he faced a stark reality. In the eyes of society, was he truly free? The stigma of his conviction clung to him like a second skin, threatening to suffocate his hard-won knowledge and determination. Marcus took his first steps as a free man, the weight of his legal books a reminder of the battle ahead. The world had changed in his absence. Smartphones and social media were everywhere, leaving him feeling like a stranger in a familiar land. His family welcomed him with open arms, but he saw the worry etched in their faces. They knew the road ahead would be far from easy. The challenges of re-entry hit Marcus like a tidal wave. Applying for jobs became an exercise in humiliation. Each application required him to check the box admitting to his felony conviction. Interviews that started promisingly ended abruptly when his past came to light. The statistics he had studied in prison now played out in his own life. Ex-offenders were 50% less likely to receive a callback or job offer than those without a criminal record. Nights were the hardest. Marcus would lie awake, his mind racing with legal strategies to challenge his conviction. He pored over his case files, looking for any overlooked detail that could prove his innocence. The injustice of it all burned in his chest, fueling his determination to fight back against the system that had robbed him of a decade. Marcus's search for legal representation proved equally frustrating. Most lawyers he approached saw his case as hopeless, a battle against a system too entrenched to change. But Marcus refused to give up. He attended legal aid clinics, seeking advice and connections. He shared his story at community meetings, hoping to find someone who would believe in his cause. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Marcus met Sarah Chen, a tough, experienced civil rights attorney known for taking on impossible cases. Their first meeting was intense. Sarah grilled Marcus for hours, dissecting every aspect of his case. Her eyes narrowed as she listened, occasionally jotting notes in a worn leather notebook. "I won't lie to you, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This fight will be brutal. The system doesn't like admitting its mistakes. Are you prepared for what that means?" Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. "Ms. Chen, I've spent 10 years preparing for this moment. I'm ready to take on whatever comes my way." A hint of a smile played at Sarah's lips. "Then let's get to work. We've got a long road ahead of us." As Marcus left Sarah's office, a mix of emotions swirled within him. Hope, fear, determination, all competing for dominance. He knew the battle ahead would test every ounce of strength and knowledge he had gained. But for the first time since his release, Marcus felt a spark of real optimism. With Sarah by his side, he was ready to take on the system that had failed him and so many others. The fight for justice was about to begin in earnest. The spark of optimism Marcus felt leaving Sarah's office would soon be tested by a harsh reality. As they began to build their case, Marcus and Sarah uncovered a web of corruption far more intricate than they had imagined. Could they really hope to untangle it? Sarah's office became a war room, walls covered with timelines, legal precedents, and potential witnesses. Marcus pored over his case files, reliving every excruciating moment of his arrest and trial. His hands shook as he detailed the racial slurs muttered by the arresting officers, the public defender's apathy, and Judge Harrison's thinly veiled contempt. Sarah listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she pieced together their strategy. "We're not just fighting your conviction, Marcus," she explained. "We're taking on a system that's been broken for generations." As they dug deeper, resistance mounted. Requests for court records were mysteriously delayed. Potential witnesses suddenly became unreachable. Even Sarah's colleagues warned her against pursuing the case, hinting at potential consequences for her career. Marcus felt the weight of their opposition pressing down on him. Nightmares of his time in prison returned, leaving him drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The prospect of facing Judge Harrison again filled him with a paralyzing dread. "Maybe this is a mistake," he confided to Sarah during a moment of weakness. "What if we lose? What if I end up back in that cell?" Sarah's response was firm but compassionate. "Fear is natural, Marcus. But remember why we're doing this. It's not just about you anymore. It's about every person who's been wronged by this system." Her words reignited Marcus's determination, but the challenges ahead remained daunting. Expert after expert warned them of the near impossibility of proving judicial misconduct. "Judges have broad discretion," one legal scholar cautioned. "Unless you have a smoking gun, it's your word against theirs." Yet as news of their case spread, something unexpected happened. Members of Marcus's community began to come forward with their own stories of injustice. A local church offered its basement for strategy meetings. Law students volunteered to help with research. Marcus found himself at the center of a growing movement for change. The night before their first court appearance, Marcus stood before a crowd at a community center. His voice trembled as he began to speak, but gained strength with each word. "Tomorrow, we take our first step towards justice. Not just for me, but for all of us who've been silenced and forgotten by a system that was meant to protect us." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Marcus felt a surge of energy course through him, washing away his doubts. As he looked out at the sea of supportive faces, he knew that win or lose, this fight was about something far bigger than his own freedom. Later that night, as Marcus prepared his suit for court, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him was no longer a victim, but a warrior ready for battle. Tomorrow, he would face his demons and the corrupt system that created them. The road ahead would be difficult, but Marcus was no longer walking it alone. Marcus's heart pounded as he entered the courtroom, his eyes immediately locking onto Judge Harrison. The man who had stolen a decade of his life now sat behind the defendant's table, his face a mask of stern indifference. The air crackled with tension as both sides prepared to present their cases. Sarah Chen, Marcus's attorney, delivered a powerful opening statement. She painted a vivid picture of systemic racism and judicial misconduct, her voice steady but filled with righteous anger. As she spoke, Marcus noticed Judge Harrison's jaw tightening, his knuckles widening as he gripped the edge of the table. The parade of witnesses began, each one revealing another layer of the injustice Marcus had faced. A former clerk testified about Judge Harrison's pattern of harsher sentences for minority defendants. Marcus's old public defender, visibly uncomfortable, admitted to being overwhelmed and unprepared during the original trial. The most damning testimony came from a surprise witness, a retired bailiff who had worked in Judge Harrison's courtroom for years. He recounted numerous instances of the judge using racial slurs in private and boasting about teaching those people a lesson through his sentencing. As the bailiff spoke, Marcus felt a surge of emotions, vindication, anger, and a deep sadness for all the lives Judge Harrison had impacted. He glanced at the jury, noticing several members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. The defense team fought back hard, attempting to discredit Marcus and the witnesses. They portrayed Marcus as a criminal looking for a payday, questioning his behavior in prison and his motives for pursuing the case. During cross-examination, their questions grew increasingly aggressive, trying to provoke an angry response from Marcus, but Marcus remained calm, drawing on the inner strength he had cultivated during his years behind bars. He answered each question thoughtfully, his voice never wavering as he recounted the injustices he had faced. Sarah's careful preparation had paid off. Marcus was unshakable. As the trial neared its end, the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. Both sides delivered impassioned closing arguments, leaving the jury with the monumental task of weighing years of systemic injustice against the letter of the law. The deliberation seemed to stretch on forever. Marcus sat with his family, trying to distract himself from the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He caught glimpses of Judge Harrison across the room, the older man's confident demeanor now replaced by a nervous energy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. As the verdict was read aloud, Marcus held his breath. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Marcus Johnson, and award damages in the amount of $8 million. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps, cries, and muffled cheers. Marcus sat stunned, the weight of the moment crashing over him like a wave. He turned to Sarah, tears welling in his eyes, and embraced her tightly. As the reality of their victory sank in, Marcus realized this was more than just a personal triumph, it was a step towards justice for countless others who had suffered similar fates. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The verdict was a powerful statement, but the fight for true systemic change was far from over. With the weight of his unjust imprisonment finally lifted, Marcus steeled himself for the challenges that lay ahead, ready to turn his hard-won victory into a force for lasting change. $8 million. A life-changing sum for most, but for Marcus, it represented something far more valuable than money. What he was about to do next would send shockwaves through the entire criminal justice system. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus sat motionless, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions. Joy and relief battled with a deep-seated anger that still burned within him. He had won, yes, but at what cost? A decade of his life, irretrievably lost. Memories of missed birthdays, holidays, and life milestones with his family flooded his mind. Sarah squeezed his shoulder, her voice cutting through the fog of his thoughts. "You did it, Marcus. You stood up to the system and won." Marcus nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "We did it. But it's not enough, is it?" Sarah's expression softened. "No, it's not. But it's a start." In the days that followed, Marcus found himself grappling with an unexpected sense of responsibility. The weight of his victory pressed down on him, demanding action. He couldn't shake the faces of the men he'd left behind in prison, many of whom he knew were as innocent as he had been. Late one night, unable to sleep, Marcus began researching. The statistics he uncovered were staggering. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, over 2,800 people had been exonerated since 1989, collectively losing more than 25,000 years of their lives to wrongful imprisonment. And these were just the cases that had been overturned. How many more innocent people were still behind bars, their voices unheard? The next morning, Marcus called Sarah. "I want to use the settlement money to help others," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I want to start a foundation." Over the next few months, Marcus threw himself into establishing the New Chapter Foundation. Its mission was clear: to fight systemic racism in the justice system and provide legal support to those wrongfully convicted. He assembled a team of dedicated lawyers, investigators, and social workers, all committed to the cause of justice. The foundation's first case involved a young man named Jamal, serving a 15-year sentence for a crime he swore he didn't commit. As Marcus reviewed the case files, he saw echoes of his own story: racial profiling, inadequate legal representation, and a judge all too eager to hand down a harsh sentence. As word of the foundation spread, more cases poured in. Marcus found himself working long hours, his phone constantly buzzing with calls from families desperate for help. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. Each small victory, a retrial granted, a sentence reduced, an exoneration won, fueled Marcus's determination to keep fighting. 1 year after the foundation's launch, Marcus stood before a crowd at a community center, much like he had done before his own trial. But this time, he spoke not as a man seeking justice for himself, but as a beacon of hope for others. "Our work has only just begun," he said, his voice resonating through the packed room. "The system is broken, but we are not. Together, we can rewrite the story of justice in this country, one case at a time." As applause filled the room, Marcus felt a sense of purpose stronger than he'd ever known. He had transformed his pain into power, his injustice into action. The road ahead was long, but Marcus was ready for the fight. This was more than just a new chapter in his life, it was the beginning of a movement. Marcus's journey from wrongful conviction to justice advocate serves as a powerful testament to the human spirit's resilience. Through education and unwavering determination, he transformed his pain into purpose, shining a light on the deep-rooted issues plaguing our criminal justice system. Yet his story is just one among thousands. The fight for a fair and equitable justice system continues. Systemic racism, inadequate legal representation, and judicial misconduct still rob innocent people of their freedom every day. Marcus's New Chapter Foundation offers hope, but it can't solve these problems alone. We all have a role to play in this ongoing struggle. Support organizations working to overturn wrongful convictions. Educate yourself about racial bias in policing and sentencing. Speak out against injustice when you see it. Together, we can build a system that truly delivers justice for all.